During the heyday of the Gemini program, a ragtag group of engineers got together and began tackling the difficult task of how the agency was going to train its astronauts to land on the moon. The concept they came up with was as unconventional as it was fitting as one would imagine it to be for such an unusual task. Affectionately or unaffectionately named the Flying Bedstead for its eerie resemblance to the aforementioned, the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, or LLTV for its official designation, was comprised of a restored turbojet engine taken out of a scrap heap and vertically mounted on a minimalistic frame, a seat for the pilot, and the bare minimum systems for attitude control in the form of HT3 thrusters. While the initial idea on the first flight seemed rather promising as well as a little goofy, the limitations of the current design, along with its associated risks to pilots, ground crews, infrastructure, and even the local wildlife, quickly became apparent, and the program was promptly scrapped. But at least one person in the upper brass managed to see what the others had not. The newly redesigned Lunar Lander Training Vehicle, with its noticeable design heritage, featured a series of important improvements over its humble predecessor. The initial concept remained the same, that of a vertically mounted turbojet engine, which would mimic the lunar module's centerline thrust during the critical phase of a powered descent, and 4 sets of quad thrusters for attitude control, just like the LEM. Among the noticeable changes and improvements were larger and more powerful quad thrusters, and these were mounted further away for greater control authority. Moreover, the craft additionally featured an improved avionics suite, better weight distribution for improved balance, a greater fuel load for longer duration flights, a wider base for improved stability upon landing, and of course, the all too important Mark II yeet seat, capable of safely ejecting the pilot even at the lowest altitudes. 2 versions of the LLTV were produced, LLTV number 1 and LLTV number 2, and together they would provide unparalleled flight training experiences for both lunar module pilots and commanders who had been selected for lunar landings. One thing was certain, whenever crews came to train, crowds of people from all the local facilities were sure to gather to look at the ungainly sight soaring in the skies, flying with as much grace as one could imagine for such an odd-looking contraption. But strange looking as it might have been, the LLTVs did something that no other technology could do, and that was provide unparalleled realism to what lunar module crews would experience come that fateful time in every lunar mission. Simply put, the landing trainers gave crews the closest sensation and sensorial stimulation, coupled with honest-to-goodness stick and throttle feedback that no lab-driven simulator could ever hope to achieve. After all, nothing beats the real deal like actual hardware. The engineers who designed the newest versions of the LLTVs had utilized the data they had obtained from the sole spaceflight of the lunar module and had designed the LLTVs so as to precisely match the pitch, yaw, and roll attitude rates of the real thing. For each flight, crews practiced various approach patterns and trained for every possible contingency, such as last-minute flight path changes and ground collision avoidance maneuvers. Additionally, the LLTVs allowed crews to practice and develop the key skills required to land a lunar module, such as lateral speed arrestment, vertical speed rates, and energy management, and even what the ideal thump for a perfect landing should be. But by far the greatest benefit of cumulative flight time on the trainers was what many coined the putting game. Borrowed from the world of golfing, it referred to how easily one could mess a solid flight or game by screwing up the final moments before touchdown, just like a bad putting game in a game of golf. As capable a craft as she was, the LLTVs could be just as unforgiving. The flight envelope within which she would fly safely offered little in terms of margin, and even less in terms of one's ability to recover from an overly enthusiastic set of maneuvers. Even the most seasoned veterans could often find themselves caught out by what they described as unpredictable snaps, where, if one wasn't careful, she could quickly turn on you and bite you, especially in those vital moments. The narrow width of those tight margins would soon become apparent as crews began to push the envelope a little further and just a little too much. The unique contributions of the LLTV would go down in history as having played an invaluable role in the success of not only the very first lunar landing, but of every subsequent landing mission as well. The lander program would eventually be terminated from fear that the unthinkable just might happen after one too many mishaps. Whatever bits and pieces remained were either sent to the scrapyard or to the local visitor center. Infamous as she was, the flying bedstead would find itself a home in the hearts of all who would one day walk on the moon, due to her unique and invaluable contributions.
Oxygen and nitrogen, 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen.
In the short confines of time that spanned the last couple of decades, we had gone from the first ever flights to breaking the sound barrier, to the first satellites in orbit, the first person in orbit, and now, this, the first ever flight to the lunar surface, with souls on board. In the psyche and imagination of all, the mission of Apollo 6 was the stuff of legends. It was an endeavor that was centuries in the making.
Arm that has been attached to the spacecraft up to now will be moved back now. In 5 seconds, the swing arm will come back. Mark.
TS is CSA 9. Arm 9 is retracted.
Yes, CBTS, copy.
First, that one single, ominous little word that within the right context resonates with such impact, defines with such clarity, appeals to the senses, and touches the very soul. That one singular word that serves to summarize, like no other, the very meaning of accomplishment, of achieving that which was greatest to achieve. First across an ocean, the first to reach new shores, the first to fly, the first to soar, the first to break the speed of sound, first to see the stars from above the atmosphere, first to orbit, the first to leave the earth, the first to see the far side of the moon, and the first to set foot on the surface of the moon, the first Moonwalker. Now towering over the Florida landscape, at 363 feet tall, the culmination of tens of thousands of hours by multiples of thousands, a nationwide effort, the sum of all that we had learned in the intervening years of spaceflight, sat the rocket ship that would take the first ever crew to a trip down to the lunar surface. Should all go well, they would be the first in history to do so.
It's 3 hours and 32 minutes until begins the greatest adventure in its history. If all goes well, Apollo astronauts are to lift off from pad 39A out there on the voyage always has dreamed about. So it is now, before they go, as their gleaming vehicle sits poised and peaceful.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine run.
As the flight of Apollo 6 roared on, soaring through the skies, engines roaring, shockwaves thundering, rising on a pillar of flames that could be seen from miles around. And with a thunderous sound like that of the mightiest thunderstorms of the Florida sky. More than simply a sight to be seen on account of its sheer might, the mission that would see the very first footprints on the moon, should all go well, was the very embodiment of history in the making. Just as they had practiced in the simulators, the crew could be heard making the various callouts just as they had done countless times before, as the rocket hit milestone after milestone, right on cue, only this time was the real deal. First, the S1C, then the S2, and then the S4B. One by one, each stage on the Saturn delivered. As stage after stage came to life and, once depleted, was succeeded by the next, back on the ground, thousands of engineers and technicians breathed a sigh of relief. For not only was Apollo 6 the first attempt at a lunar landing, it was also the first ever flight of the Saturn V, manned or unmanned. As a mixture of relief and elation filled the air at mission control, as well as the command module. Crew and mission planners alike began planning for the next critical phase in the mission.
Houston. Go ahead, Houston. You are go for CLI, over. Roger, understand. We're go for CLI.
Trans-lunar injection. The J2 had never before been relit in 0G, but once again, the Saturn delivered, and with the burn complete, the crew were on their way. Now moving fast enough to leave the vicinity of home. With a few thrown switches in the cockpit, the command and service module freed itself from the S4B, revealing the odd-looking but critically important lunar module. Kabenski, carefully and with surgeon-like precision, guided the nearly 30-ton craft towards its intended target. With a quick little pirouette and a few adjustments, the two ships were aligned for docking. A series of maneuvers he had practiced hundreds of times before. In actuality, were it not for the rocket ride up into space that had just occurred, and the now feeling of weightlessness, he could hardly tell this wasn't a sim. In a few short moments, the lunar module would be freed from its cocoon, emerging like a butterfly, ready to spread its wings.
We can't be more than about 5-10 feet away. Roger. It's looking real stable to us. We show you close in 5 minutes. Be docked in a second, I hope. Roger. Snap, and we're there. Got 2 grays. Roger. You're looking good. We can see the markings in a rendezvous with it. Looks like you just docked. Get on the docket, Charlie. King, we can read the numbers on the limb docking window.
With both ships connected together, locked at the hatches, Kabenski flipped the one switch that sent a command to the S4B's onboard computers, telling the locking mechanism that held the lunar module in its place to release it and let go. Once a confirmation came through in the command module, with a single visible light giving the OK, and mission control back on Earth confirming that they too could see that the lunar module was free for extraction, Kavinsky pulled back on the stick, firing all 4 quad thrusters on the service module, and slowly began pulling the lunar module out of the S4. As for the now spent S4 stage, it would continue on its way to sail past the moon, headed for solar orbit. In the tiny little windows of the command module, out in the far distance, in the blackness of space, the crew could see it, looming in the distance, growing in size ever slowly. The moon.
Houston, Apollo, just tried looking out as far as I can out of the top hatch window and still can't see the moon, but we'll take your word that it's there.
It's there plus 60 miles.
No guarantee on that.
And Houston, 2 minutes, LOS. Everybody here says Godspeed.
Okay, and we'll see you right on the other side in orbit.
Roger.
Following loss of signal, the service module's engine would roar to life for the first time. Having reached the moon, now came the moment to slow down so as to be captured by its gravity. As the engine fired, onboard accelerometers showed the speed decreasing, and the crew kept a close eye on the numbers. With the spacecraft slowed down,
We have AOS.
Roger, Houston, you can tell the world that we have arrived.
and now back in the sunlight, the crew finally got their first up-close view of the world below.
Boy, this is really a rugged planet.
Looking out at the horizon and some of the mountains we can see down here, that's going to be a real kick tomorrow down at 50,000 feet. Over.
3 minutes going over the hill. Your go front docking, and we'll see you around the other side.
Roger.
Roger.
With the lunar module now powered up, and all systems checks showing good vital signs, Davidson and Mayer closed the hatch behind them, said their farewell, and prepared themselves for the most audacious and perilous point of the mission. The crew that had been one since mission start were now split into 2 entities. The 2 ships would slowly drift apart, ensuring a safe level of separation was reached, while the lunar module performed a slow pirouette. Kavinsky, in the command module, looked at it to visually assess that everything on the odd-looking spacecraft was nominal. With the final all-clear given, Mission Control would give the okay, and for the first time in history, a craft manned with 2 souls on board would begin its powered descent down to the lunar surface. Right on schedule, the lunar module's descent engine ignited, beginning the historic descent. Davidson and Mayer watched as fuel quantity, pressures, thrust, speed, altitude all began to change. If all went well, in less than 10 minutes, the crew of Apollo 6 would be on the lunar surface.
Feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. Looking great, your go. 5%. 185. Still looking very good. Okay, 75 feet. There's looking good, down a half.
60 seconds.
60 seconds. Lights on. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 Feet 2.5 down. Right shadow.
Stand by for 30.
4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little.
30 seconds.
1.5. 30 seconds. Forward. Good. Right. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent.
We've had shutdown.
We copy you down. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Thank you. You're looking good here.
In a moment so completely surreal that the line between reality and fantasy was all but completely effaced, what was once thought to be impossible no longer was. Amidst a barren sea of nothingness, in a world of utter desolation, sat a four-legged creature from a foreign world.
And we're getting a picture on the TV. There's a great deal of contrast in it, but we can make out a fair amount of detail. Okay, to see you coming down the ladder now. And here we see you coming. Stand by. Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up. At the foot of the ladder, the lamp foot beds are only depressed at the surface about 1 or 2 inches. And step off the lamp now. That's one small step for one giant leap for this time.
Having come so far and achieved so much to get here, what followed were moments of simple, blissful joy. So completely lighthearted was the experience that Davidson all but forgot that no one before had ever experienced what he was now experiencing. The elation in his voice was palpable, the excitement like that of a young boy at Christmas time. Out on the lunar surface, the first ever to do so, some 384,000 kilometers. It truly was an otherworldly experience. For about 20 minutes or so, Davidson was all alone in his little lunar world. One might even say the first ever true lunatic. Although constrained by mission rules to venture no further than 20 or 30 feet or so from the lunar module for safety reasons, the world he was now in was so utterly new and wonderful that the eye could hardly be satisfied with seeing, nor the mind satiated with wonder. Everything was new. Everything felt surreal. More a boy now than a bona fide astronaut, Davidson hardly noticed that his time alone on the surface had already come and gone. Next, Mayer, the second soul from a foreign world to venture onto the lunar surface, would join him.
Okay, you need a little bit of arching of the back to come down. Making sure not to lock it on my way out. Particularly good thought. That's our home for the next couple hours. We want to take good care of it.
Together, the two Kerbal crew would perform a series of simple scientific experiments to, at least in part, help justify the venture, but would also take a series of photographs with a single camera designed specifically to function in the absolutely unforgiving environment of the lunar surface. As the two astronauts performed their few tasks on the surface, including the all-important planting of the flag, back in lunar orbit, Kubenski, now by some estimates the loneliest soul in the universe, performed simple station-keeping tasks and stayed at the ready to heed whatever commands mission control just might relay to him. Armed with the finest Hasselblad could manufacture, the third member of the three-man crew busied himself taking hundreds of photographs, vicariously experiencing the lunar surface through a 300mm telephoto lens. It would ultimately be a small consolation for one who had come so close and yet was still so far away. As he orbited slowly and steady, some 60 kilometers above the lunar surface, Kubenski listened in to the comms of his fellow crewmates down below. In actuality, though he would not get to walk on the surface, he would go on to say that he never felt like he was a lesser part of the mission. Back on the surface, the prescribed planned EVA surface time now complete, now was the hour for the two-man crew to depart the world they had only just begun discovering.
5, port stage, engine arm Ascent, proceed. 36 feet per second up. 5 for the pitch over. Ride. There's that one crater down there.
1,000 feet high, 80 feet per second vertical rise.
At the exact time, the Ascent engine ignited, and the 4 explosive bolts that held the two stages together fired, releasing the Ascent stage back into the heavens.
A little bit of slow wallowing back and forth.
The engine that had never been test-fired before would go on to perform as expected and would show no signs of fading as the burn progressed. Inside, Davidson and Mayer could hardly contain their joy and amazement at all that had transpired over the past few hours. Relieved that the final major hurdle to fulfilling their journey was now behind them, all they could do now was smile in disbelief. With the two ships' orbits aligned bit by bit, the tiny lunar module ascent stage would catch up to the orbiting command module, and the two crafts would be reunited again. After a few short hours, both crafts would now again meet up in lunar orbit, as the rising sun shone on them both. For this portion of the mission, the lunar module would be passive, simply maintaining attitude, waiting for the command module, flown expertly by Kaminski, relieved and elated to see his crewmates back again, to inch closer and dock. The crew of Apollo 6 were now one again, reunited. As the hatch that separated both ships was unlocked, pressure equalized, and the hatch finally opened, a small cloud of lunar dust emanating from the lunar module made its way to the command module. That encounter would be Kaminski's one and only genuine interaction with lunar regolith of sorts, and he would go on to describe it as having one of the strangest odors he'd ever encountered. Once all of the surface samples and various other items were transferred from one ship to the other, the lunar module ascent stage, the unlikely hero of the mission that had taken them to and from the lunar surface, was jettisoned. No longer needed, its part of the mission was over with, and it would be given one final send-off into the void. Rather than risking any malfunction that could jeopardize the final phases of the mission, the ascent stage, now lifeless, would be left in lunar orbit, slowly to decay over time. Its orbit would be tracked over time, mostly for documentation purposes, for although some information could be gained from the data, ultimately, there was little use for it. For one final time, the service propulsion engine fired up, and with that, the crew of Apollo 6 were homebound. All the crew had now to do was to wait until the 5-day trip saw them arrive from whence they had first came. It wouldn't be long until the Earth would grow in size until it dwarfed everything in sight and filled the small command module windows. With the service module jettisoned, the crew strapped into their seats, donned helmets and pressure suits, started O2 flow, armed drogue and main parachutes, as well as a re-entry sequence pre-programmed in the command module. All they could do now was be passengers as the ship passed through the inferno of a lunar re-entry in Earth's atmosphere. With only a few miles off course from their intended landing spot, the naval recovery ship Hornet saw the red and white parachutes and confirmed to the world that the crew of Apollo 6 were home. At exactly 196 hours, 18 minutes, and 35 seconds, the mission of Apollo 6 was officially over. That's going to do it for this episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please be sure to like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel to grow. And tell me what your thoughts on the episode are in the comments below. A special shout out goes out to all of my patrons. Your financial support really means the world to me. If you'd like to support the channel in a special way, head on over to the Calvin Maclure Patreon page. If you'd like to just make a one-time donation, just sub to any tier of your liking and cancel at any time. A little can really help make a difference in a big way. Thanks to everyone for your continued support. I'm Calvin Maclure, and I'll see you next time.
As the service is fine and boundary, I can take it up briefly with my to the sole and insides of my boots. With my toe, it does. Here, there seems to be no difficulty in moving around as we suspected treads and the fine sandy particles. In the fine layers, like modern charcoal, I only go in small fraction of an inch, maybe an eighth of an inch, but I can see that we performed in various simulations on the ground. It's even perhaps easier than the simulations of 160 that we performed in various speeds and footprints of my boots and the treads